Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Yeah, that's a Tiger King joke. Hey, week three, lesson one. Um, for this week, I've mixed things up a little bit. We are going to, I'm pairing these lectures with documentaries. That'll give you, because we're in the 20th and 21st century now. So I thought it'd be good to have um, some documentaries that show you actual footage of what's happening. So that's what we're going to do this week. And these lectures are going to be a lot shorter, hopefully. And I really just want to highlight some things from the readings. So make sure you do the Paul Harvey PDF file that's in the box. That gives you an overview of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Make sure you read the documents. And then make sure you watch the documentary and watch this. And this is sort of your guide through that material to get you ready for the quiz that's coming up. I'm on my porch. You may hear cars pass by. I hope it's not too much of a distraction. We're not going to do this for long. All right, here we go. So, what I want to hit on, I'm just going to hit some of the key things I want you to be able to know out of these materials. First, I want to talk about the 5 things that sort of where religion and the civil rights movement intersect. And then we're going to look at a few examples. Howard Thurman, Birmingham, Mississippi and the Freedom Summer, Malcolm X, James Cone, and Cesar Chavez to talk a little bit about Latino, specifically Mexican-American experiences in there. All right, so that's where we're going. I'm going to go kind of fast, but you can always slow this down. You can always go back, use the slide function on Panopto. So there are sort of 5 ways that we see religion intersecting with the civil rights movement. The emphasis on nonviolence, as we'll see, comes from some interesting sources, drawing on Howard Thurman's encounter with Gandhi. The same sort of biblical narratives and metaphors that we've seen in Black Christianity throughout the semester continue. Things about that we'll see happening again. A new twist is a much more political understanding of Jesus. That Jesus, in his particular first century context, was a political revolutionary. We'll talk more about that. And then, as always, there's talked about the fact that Black churches become central institutions for the civil rights movement, central institutions for African American communities, even to this day, but specifically in this period. And then you'll see, and this is more in the documentary, pay attention to the role of music and songs. So at the bottom 2, Black churches and the community and the songs. These marches start with singing in churches and they end with singing in churches. That there's singing in churches and songs are a kind of community building ritual, as a unifying way of connecting people in these movements. And so there's a kind of sociology to the music that I think is important. All right, so let's look at some examples. First one we need to talk about is Howard Thurman. So Thurman draws on what was called the social gospel, which was part of that liberal Protestant mainstream that the modernist Protestant movement that we talked about a few weeks ago, last week, I guess, that emphasized that the gospel, that the kingdom of God, the message of Christianity, the message of Jesus was something that was supposed to happen in this world through solving social problems. So he was worked with the YMCA, which was an early social gospel movement group. It's not just a place where you go to the gym. They actually did a lot of work in sort of social uplift in urban settings. And then in 1935, Thurman and his wife went to India and met with Mohandas Gandhi. And this Sanskrit term that Gandhi used, ahimsa, which literally means no harm or non-violence, literally means no harm. Himsa means harm. Put an A in front of anything in Sanskrit, it becomes ahimsa. That's not that, so not harm. And he really saw a lot of similarities between the situation of African Americans under Jim Crow and the racial oppression of African Americans in America with the colonial oppression of Indians in India, which at that time was still controlled by the British government, by the British, part of the British Empire. So he sees these comparisons and he sees the nonviolence of Gandhi's resistance to colonialism as a way to think about Black resistance to white supremacy in the United States. And he taught at Howard University. He was a minister and a professor at Howard, where he taught Martin Luther King Jr. as a big influence on King. And so King's nonviolence comes from Gandhi. And what's also interesting to think about is that Gandhi's interest in nonviolence and ahimsa came from his reading of the Bhagavad Gita, but also from his reading of people like Henry David Thoreau, the American. So there's a bunch of American writer. So there's this kind of like circulation of ideas here that's kind of interesting. But it's important to know who Thurman was as an influence on King and as an early thinker in terms of the civil rights movement. Sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of the people who would be involved in the decades later. So I want to focus the Birmingham 1963. This what is as a car comes by. Birmingham 1963 is sort of central to the documentary. So watch it. So Project C was the name of these of the Birmingham protests, the marches. But watch the documentary and pay particular attention to those 5 things I mentioned earlier. You'll see all of them, but you'll especially see the last 2 about the role of black churches and the role of music. Also pay attention to how the story shifts. What happened in Albany versus what happened in Birmingham. Why was Albany a failure and Birmingham succeeded? How did figures how did the authorities handle things differently in Birmingham than in Albany? So, okay. This is mentioned in the reading, turning over to the Paul Harvey chapter that I assigned you. Fannie Lou Hamer and the 1964 Freedom Summer in Mississippi. This is the summer after, a year after all the stuff we talk about in Birmingham. And this was an effort to get registered African Americans to vote. So it was explicitly kind of political movement. But Hamer, and this is where we get to talk about Jesus as a revolutionary, Hamer specifically saw Jesus in his first century context as a Jew living under Roman occupation. So in her view, and her reading, this is a common reading that you'll see in this sort of liberation, we'll talk about is liberation theology, but this idea that Jesus was killed by the Romans on a cross, which is a political form of execution, right? So if you look at the first century, the Jewish way of executing people in Jewish practice was stoning, right? And there were plenty of Christians who were stoned by Jews early on. Not plenty, but for example, Stephen in the New Testament, the early Christian, is stoned to death by Jewish leaders. Crucifixion was a Roman execution, and it was a political execution. And so there's a reading that becomes very important to these movements that sees Jesus as a Jew in the first century living in the Roman Empire under the power and oppression of Rome, whose death is that of one who's pushing back against empire and pushing back against the power structures around him. And that view of a political Jesus is central to Fannie Lou Hamer and others who went down and said, and sort of bathed the registration of African American voters as a kind of sacralized it as a Christian effort, right? In the same way that Jesus was a revolutionary, that there would be political revolution to give freedom and rights to African Americans in the South. This Freedom Summer involved a bunch of people from all over the country, especially from the north, coming down into Mississippi. This included African Americans who were organizers like Fannie Lou Hamer, but also northern white clergy and student organizations. In fact, the National Council of Churches that we talked about last week, all of those mainline modernist Protestant organizations, they were sending down clergy and students. Sorry about that. I had a child interrupt me to make sure I got his homeschool fixed. So the Freedom Summer was this movement that bust in from the North and Midwest, clergy and young student groups, and it became very violent. Fannie Lou Hamer was shot at in a drive-by by the KKK. Many of the white organizers were murdered. It became there was a violent backlash to the efforts, and not that many African Americans were actually registered in Mississippi to vote because of it, but it created such a national outcry over the violence that it led towards the civil rights changes and the Voting Rights Act that would follow. From a very different understanding of Christianity, you have Malcolm X, and you read X's take on Christianity, where he rejects it. He sees Christianity not as a tool with Jesus as a revolutionary, but as a tool of white oppression. And so Malcolm joins the Nation of Islam when he's in jail in the 50s, and comes out with a message of really black pride and self-defense, as Paul Harvey talks about it, that African Americans must defend themselves against white oppression, and that might be violent self-defense. The other thing is that Malcolm has this is part of the Nation of Islam, but then he decides to take, and the Nation of Islam, I should say, is a very particular, unique form of Islam that's quite different, black Islam in that way, quite different than other forms of Islam you'll find. And so when Malcolm leaves and goes to Mecca to do the Hajj, this pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim must take, he sees a whole other world of Islam, and he sees people from all over Northern Africa, from all over West Africa, from all over the Middle East, from all over the world in Mecca on the Hajj, and he realizes this sort of massive, bigger Islam that he had no knowledge about. And he actually he leaves the Nation of Islam and turns to a very new message, sort of not so much focused on sort of black pride and self-defense, but more of a kind of Pan-Africanism, seeing African Americans as part of a larger African community that's bigger than just the United States. And he's actually, as he makes this shift away from the Nation of Islam, is assassinated by Nation of Islam in 1965. He was shot like 20 some times during a speech in public, and shot with a sawed-off shotgun. So Malcolm is this interesting figure who offers another view of Christianity that doesn't turn to black churches, doesn't turn to Christianity as a source for revolution or rights or resilience in the face of white supremacy and Jim Crow and all of these things, but instead says, no, that's actually the tools of the masters, is kind of the language he would use. That Christianity was used to pacify and enslave and oppress black people, and so they should reject it altogether. Now, James Cone is a shift back, and you read about him at the end of the chapter, and you read some of his work. He's a shift back to Christian theology, and like Fannie Lou Hamer, we see for Cone this emphasis on what becomes known as liberation theology, which is that the key point of Christianity is not individual salvation, but is the liberation of the oppressed in every situation throughout time and space, right? And so it's an idea that the Bible and Christianity and the message of Jesus is really about freeing people who are under the thumb of power. And so the two examples that we already talked about is this idea of Jesus as a first century Jew living under Roman oppression who's killed by the empire. The second view is a view of the God of the Old Testament and the ancient Hebrews who were slaves in Egypt and then freed. That throughout, and not just that story, but throughout the Old Testament, the emphasis on justice, and that God is always on the side of the oppressed, of the poor, of the widow, of the orphan. And so Cone has a famous book on the cross and the lynching tree, in which he makes this comparison between Jesus' execution and the oppression, the lynchings, the violence against black people. And so this black theology, this unique liberation theology, is what Cone is sort of known for and central to black theology in African American churches after him. So shifting out of the African American examples, I just wanted to highlight quickly Cesar Chavez, who is not drawing on Protestant traditions like everyone else we've talked about, who's Latino instead of African American. But he's drawing on a specific Catholic social justice tradition. The Pope Leo XIII in 1891 issued Rerum Novarum, which was a papal encyclical, another sort of a statement from the Pope on Catholic teaching, about industrialization and labor. And this is the middle of the Industrial Revolution. And there's this tradition of saying that worker rights and respective workers in the Catholic tradition, and a pushback against capitalism and capitalism sort of run amok, that Chavez is drawing on. In 1968, as farm workers in California were striking against labor practices, poor pay, poor working conditions, um, Chavez went on strike, and he actually went on strike and fasted, went on a hunger strike. Uh, and while he was doing this, he was also doing offering mass um, and other things, and sort of sacralizing this protest. I like this picture of him because you can see behind him the grapes there. That's part of a larger poster about boycotting California grapes. And then on the other side, you see the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? That he brings these two things together. That his work was always taking the iconography of striking and the signs of picket lines, and then the iconography of the Catholic Church, and the sort of Mexican Catholic identity that he tied up with the workers' rights movement in the late 60s in California. So these are just some examples of um, how race factors in this period of upheaval in the 60s. And we're going to see the response to that by sort of conservative white Protestants in the next lecture. But pay attention specifically in that documentary to what's happening in Birmingham and the role of the churches and the role of singing and the role of King as you watch that documentary. All right. Hope you all are well, and I will see you again soon.